Okay, good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here to the Centre for Social Research in Health. My name is Giselle Newton. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Centre. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where we meet today, the Gadigal people. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Today it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Paul Byron to the Centre. Paul Byron is a researcher at the University of Technology, Sydney, and Swinburne University's Department of Media and Communication. His research focuses on digital media, young people, and peer support practices, particularly among LGBTQ+ young people. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Digital Media, Friendship and Cultures of Care. Please make him welcome.
Thank you, Giselle. Thank you all for being here. And I'd also like to also acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and this land we meet. And note that sovereignty was never ceded. Thank you all for coming and joining us. Hey, what I'm going to be doing today is talking about, actually it's a chapter from a book, if I'm telling the truth. But it's also something that's leading into my next research project. So I'm very interested in getting some feedback, your thoughts, any ideas you have, I'd love to hear them. So I'm going to try and keep it to about 30 minutes, so we've got lots of discussion time possible. What I'm kind of doing is bringing media studies perspectives to health research, but in quite a serious way that isn't always done. So as looking around the room, there's a lot of health researchers here. I'm very, very interested to get your perspectives on what I'm presenting as well on that basis. How do I do this? Nope. How do I? Oh, it does now. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is a chapter of a book that I'm currently writing, which is due next month, which certainly won't be finished. This is chapter 5. So the book is the title so far, Friendship, Digital Media and Cultures of Care. It's also a book about young people, which I've purposefully left out of the title, and I'll see what the editor says about that. I'm not sure. My interest, my research practice is around young people. And it's around friendship. So the first 2 chapters I'm talking about friendship and peers and how we talk about those things and how sometimes we talk about those things as the same thing or as different things and why that matters, but also how digital media cultures have really messed up with definitions we may still be using. Particularly when we think about peers and peer education. And even since the 80s, there's been a lot of critique of peer education as being a strange concept if you think about it. If young people are the same age as other young people, therefore they're their peers, therefore they influence each other in ways that we as adults cannot. That's kind of a rough sketch of that. But there's some obvious problems with that kind of logic. If we think about friendship and social media, Facebook friendship, for example, we know that's shifted things a little bit too, how we think about friends, how researchers might understand friendships, and how young people themselves might understand them. Anyway, I talk about digital expertise, I talk about sexual health and friendship, and this is about mental health, and also talk about dating apps and friendships through dating apps. So why am I talking about care or cultures of care? I'm arguing that care is typically associated with formal health care. We don't often talk about it. We talk about young people providing each other with support and information in digital spaces, but we don't often talk about that as a form of care. And as I go through, hopefully that will become clear. Actually, I'll tell you now. So studies of LGBTQ young people and digital media typically focus on individual practices. So we typically approach young people and say, okay, what do you do on Snapchat, Tumblr, whatever? What do you get from that? What information do you find from that? These are the sorts of questions we tend to ask. And we ask about information and support seeking, but we don't ask about the provision of information. But we don't ask about the cultures of information and support sharing, and also what I would call the culture of care. And we often focus on coming out and self-acceptance. Whereas the digital cultures focus, taking a more cultural studies approach, looks at cultures, spaces, and practices of support. So how people are participating as carers, but also as people receiving information. We need to think about caregiving and the spatial aspects of care, so the platforms, the networks that are involved. And we need to think about how formal healthcare, or this can help us think about how formal healthcare, or what it lacks, and also what it can't provide, because often we're trying to make formal healthcare provide everything for young people. Arguably, it cannot do that. So going back a few years, looking at, I think probably some of the earlier Australian data, you probably can't see that, but I'll talk you through it. On this is from Blues to Rainbows report from La Trobe University, 2014. And I think this is the first evidence that I saw where people are kind of taking friendship and digital networks a bit more seriously. There's graphs, so we know that it's serious. And this is about information and support, exactly. And the first question is about social activities and people who are engaged to feel better. And the top 3 responses there are spending time with friends, chatting with friends online, and texting and calling friends. So the blue represents that makes people feel better, and the black says they don't do this, and the red makes you feel worse. So when we get down to family, the red is the worst. And so I think health professionals somewhere are here. So that's about support. And we see very clearly that friendship in digital cultures. Although the questions I would sort of want to know with that is what kind of friendships are we talking about? Chatting with friends online, does that mean people you've never met? Or does that mean you're closest? Or is it both? And again, as researchers, thinking about the ways we might frame these things a little bit differently. Sources of information, websites, research, which I found quite interesting up there, blogs, YouTube, social media, peers. So blogs, in the report, they talk about Tumblr under blogs. So Tumblr is probably why that's so high, which I'll come to shortly. And again, we're seeing an interesting kind of, these are the choices that participants were given. And certainly no shade to the researchers who, this report is fantastic. But I think 5 years down the track, we probably want to ask why. Yeah.
Just a quick question. When you say young people, what's captured there from about what age to what age?
So this report, I think, was up to 25. I could be wrong, actually. I don't have, this is a report from La Trobe, and it's specifically trans and gender diverse young people. And they're about 200. Anyway, so my point here is social media, peers, YouTube, blogs, they're all kind of overlapping in very interesting ways, which that doesn't tell us much about, which I think we soon should start doing more on. That is one of many, many reports from the last 10 or so years specifically around LGBT young people and mental health. And here's a list. What I found interesting is in every one of these reports, there is mention of friendship and digital networks as being really, really important for young people. Support, but also information. And at the same time, none of them report that as a key finding. Admittedly, some of them don't report key findings and some of them don't offer recommendations, but those that do, they don't tend to fall into the recommendations either. With the exception of McDermott, Hughes, and Rawlings. who do offer a key finding around particularly digital peer networks. And actually we did it too here in Sydney, but kind of in a really vague, not particularly useful way. So I guess a pet peeve that I have as a digital media scholar and looking at the research is that we're still talking about young people going online. And young people are not going online. Young people, as Mark Durst argues, for all of us, not just young people, there is a life as lived in rather than with media. We are living in media. We are constantly engaging with each other and a range of people we don't even know, pretty much all of the time. And we don't think about moving in and out of those spaces as much as maybe we did 20 years ago. He also says, when thinking about the context and consequences of living in rather than with media, one indeed conceives of a life with and through rather than next to or beside technology. And I think that's an important point for health researchers who are going online to engage with young people, because I think there is a tendency for people to go, oh, well, here's the message. Here's what we need to tell people. Here's what we need people to learn. So we'll fix it all up, tidy it, and then we'll go put it over there. In a space, I guess for them it is a bit like going online, or into those particular spaces. Okay, so the data that I'm going to be talking about today comes from two different studies. So I'm just going to call this one the 2010 study because that was one of the organizations and that's where I was based when I worked on that, from 2015 to 2016. And then they're scrolling beyond binaries from 2016 to 2017. As you can see through surveys and focus groups, surveys and interviews, around 2,000 young people were engaged. This one up to 25 years, here up to 35. This one's about mental health and help seeking, and with a particular focus on help seeking through formal sources. So through psychologists, GPs, etc. This one's all about social media. And it was kind of about gathering the history of young people's social media practices. The platforms they use, why, when, how, all that kind of stuff. But particularly focusing on connection, community, and well-being as well. So across the two, I think we've got some fairly decent evidence around mental health support and care of young LGBTQ. I should mention too, both projects use the LGBTIQ. In what I'm reporting from the scrolling on binaries, I'm not including that because we had very little representation of intersectional people, and I'm aware of things around that. And today also, I'm not going to be presenting any research on intersectional people, unfortunately. Okay, so with many young people in the 2010 survey, there was a lot of data on health professionals not kind of being very good at managing young people's mental health, particularly trans young people's mental health. So here are three examples, which I'll let you read. So, and this is from the report that we published a few years ago as well. So as you can see, negotiating mental health or negotiating being transgender has caused a lot of problems for people in health services, in formal healthcare. You know, being kind of asked repeatedly about your gender, about your identity, and many people talked about their sexual identity also came up, particularly if they were, you know, for example, pansexual or asexual. A lot of health professionals, or certainly some that our participants engaged with, wanted to know about that. and they were like, "Oh, I'm actually here for something else." So that gives us some context into why peer support is as important as it is. And here's a couple of other examples. So sometimes gender stuff triggers anxiety stuff, or sometimes anxiety stuff triggers gender stuff. But other than it kind of overlapping, it's technically two separate issues. And when you need to deal with both of them, sometimes you need to deal with one of them by themselves. And it's kind of hard to get health professionals to do that sometimes. So basically what was said before. Then someone else says that I don't think it's really effective counselling when you have to leave part of yourself behind when you walk in the door. So while many people talked about not disclosing for based on past experiences with health professionals, some people were very clearly saying, well, no, I need to be able to disclose, but I need to sort of control the conversation. And that wasn't obviously always happening. As I said, this survey for the 2010 project focused on formal healthcare. So we asked people to indicate who they've spoken to about mental health. So the majority, 48%, said GP, 46% clinical psychologist, 41% counsellor, 31% psychiatrist and helpline teacher, and other. And other tended to be family friends, nurses, youth workers, social workers. Important point being that, so 378 participants, which is well more than half, responded to this question. Most people named about 3 to 4 of those sources. So people who were engaging across different providers. But unfortunately, we didn't include people online. And I really wish we had have, because I think we would have got some nice data there. So it was a limited question, unfortunately. But I think, again, in future, we would do that differently. But where digital and social media did come up were in questions around mental health information. So we asked, how do you think access to mental health information could be improved? 18% who responded said something about digital media. And when we asked what sort of digital technologies could improve how you access information, 35% made some reference to social media, whether that was social media or Tumblr or Facebook. And people gave more detail as well. As I noted, both questions focus on information. However, support did come up as well in some of the responses that people gave. For example, someone said social media is great for realizing that you're not alone with what you're going through. Another person said, my friends and I usually find a lot of information on Tumblr because it can be like a big support group and you can talk to people going through the same thing as you. And there's already a huge amount of mental health information, one person says, that's easily accessible. And the best thing to do with this, for example, blogs, for example, Tumblr, is to help them organize better, help them advertise better, and teach young people how to find it and how to assess it and use it to help themselves. And I really love this quote because I think it's sort of inverting something. It's saying, well, actually, there's a whole lot of stuff that exists. But you keep asking me these questions about what you can do to provide something that people need. But actually, young people have already provided that for each other. And maybe you should promote that because it works and it's good. And there were a few responses like that as well. And I think it seems that they come from people quite heavily using Tumblr as well. So I think the kind of activist sort of mode of Tumblr contributes to some of those comments. So jumping now to scrolling beyond binaries, our survey, we got a lot more people. We got 1,300 responses to this. And we asked which platforms or how people use different platforms to communicate with different people. And as you can see, Facebook and Snapchat predominantly communicate with friends, so 83 to 87%. Instagram, mostly friends, but also 25% people like me. Tumblr, 3% friends, but 65% people like me. And the other category, which is only really just around Tumblr. I'm pretty sure that's fandom and celebrity stuff. So yeah, so we're kind of, again, as health researchers, we're thinking about these spaces and what they're used for and what they offer. Facebook is nothing like Tumblr, in short, but also we need to think about what this means, what we mean by people like me. And that was a concept that came up a lot also in open responsive as well. And so a couple of interview quotes from scrolling on binaries. Bailey says, Tumblr is like my heaven and my home for my self-interest stuff. There's such a wide variety of stuff. Though that you can kind of go there for anything and everything. And Casey says, I actually learned about the gender and all the other genders from Tumblr. Before that, all I really know was there are men and there are women, and that's it. So I engage with Tumblr and with the community on Tumblr, with non-binary people and trans people quite a bit. And that's from a paper that came out earlier this year, where we talk a bit more about Tumblr based on those interviews. So I'm going to focus on Tumblr a little bit now, because it is something that I think, as many of you will know, is a space where people do a lot of mental health work and they do a lot of gender, sexuality work, discussion, sharing, etc. And here I've come up with 4 genres. I'm still not totally committed to these, and hopefully the research I'm doing next year is going to I'll refine these a bit more. But here are the genres I have at the moment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So the first one, starting from the left, is what I'm calling sharing resources. And in this case, it's a hormone therapy, testosterone handout from someone's endocrinologist. And the statement below says, this is given to me by my endocrinologist. I got it a while ago and I thought it couldn't hurt to post it again. So moving resources from formal healthcare spaces into informal spaces is one practice of Tumblr. Probably not a super common practice, but it's certainly there. The second example I think would be much more common, which is the pro tip example. So a lot of you probably can't read that. At the top, it's pro tip for young trans people. Not everything you see online will work for you. For some people, binding will not work. For some people, packing will not work. For some people, voice training exercises will not work, and so on. Haircuts, clothing, etc. You're not wrong or less trans. If you try something out and it doesn't work, people have different bodies, different experiences, etc. So this works because it's coming from a space of lived experience. So this person has expertise in this space, in this economy of knowledge and sharing. And that's a very common dialogue post. The third one, which is more, I guess, mental health related, I'm calling sharing dark feelings. So this is someone experiencing gender dysphoria. And they're kind of just telling people how they feel. And they're not actually asking for advice. They're not asking for help. They're not asking for someone to solve something. They're just putting it out there. And again, they don't usually get advice or, from a post like this. That wouldn't be very common. Because again, the culture of the space is about sharing experiences. Yep.
Can you remind me too about Tumblr? You don't have to be someone's friend. It's all open access. Right?
Yes.
You don't have a project Tumblr.
Tumblr's changing a bit now. I'm not sure if it's changed, but as far as I'm aware, it's open. And you can follow people, and people follow you. And you can reblog pretty much anything, I think. And yep. The last example I've called sharing hearts and hugs and cuteness. And this came up in interviews as well. People talked about reminders, people using binders, reminders to breathe, and sort of seeing that in your feed, and then reblogging that. Knowing that someone somewhere is probably going to need that message sometime soon, they'll just kind of keep that out there. So there's something here that's not just about providing information and support. It is providing information and support, but it's also, there's I think, a culture of care. And of course, Tumblr has changed as of late last year. So whether that remains, we'll wait. And to give some context to some of the material we just looked at, or the examples, this is from a focus group of the 2010 research in Western Sydney. And we've got Taylor and Lucian here talking about sharing their mental health experiences with friends. And Taylor says, I don't want to burden my friends with giving them an overbearing amount of, I need help, oh my God, my life sucks. And Lucian says, yeah, they seem happy, you don't want to ruin the mood. And they talk about covering it up and kind of not being that friend, that, the mental health friend. So I think there's a lot going on here more than just fear of burdening one's friend. I think it's also saying that friendship isn't always the best space for this kind of thing. Part of this quote, you don't want them to be like, oh my God, really? You don't want them to be shocked and worried and concerned for you, like from that point on until forever. That can also add to one's anxiety. It can corrupt the friendship dynamic that people rely on. Friendships being a safe space for a lot of people where they can escape from a lot of the difficult stuff. So once you bring that difficult stuff into the friendship, then that might change the dynamic. But it's also about protecting your friends and caring for your friends by not actually putting that in the friendship as well. So I think, I think there's a lot in this example. Okay, so in some survey responses from scrolling non-binaries about the need for social media, people said, widens your scope of understanding. You might be stuck in an unaccepting family or community. And another 17-year-old said, yes, otherwise I'd be stuck with homophobic parents and no way to escape through talking to friends who know me for real. And I put these together on purpose because they both talk about being stuck. And I kind of like that notion of, without social media, I might be a bit stuck. So there's something, again, about, the term escape comes up a lot as well in some of these data. And so there is a sense of going to another place, in a way. Okay. So in the Scrolling Non-Binary survey, we asked a very big question. In your opinion, do the benefits of digital social media outweigh the harms, if any? Overwhelmingly, so the dark blue and the red are essentially both yes. So 74% of people said yes, 3% said no, 14% didn't answer, and 9% said 50-50, maybe, sometimes. I can't really answer this question. So they kind of troubled the question a bit. But I've split the red and the blue up into, if you can read down the bottom, yes, definite, is 56%. So people who are like absolutely, and there are a lot of absolutely. And yes, contingent. And they were responses like, well, they were the kind of yes, but responses, which I'm still wading through and finding lots of gems. But here's a bit of an example of some of what's said in the yes, buts. So it'll vary from person to person. For most people, yes. I think the younger you are, the more dangerous it is. I think, yes, but for others, I know that sometimes social media can be overwhelming. In my experience, yes. Yes, but I could understand if someone was being bullied or harassed, that they would believe that it's not worth having social media. And again, in my experience, they have been, but my experience is too narrow. And I kind of, I'm a bit in love with the yes contingent, because I think what's happening here, or how I interpret this, is that people are saying, well, for me, yeah, but I know a lot of people who aren't having that experience. And how do they know that? Well, I would presume it's probably from places like Tumblr and other digital spaces of sharing experiences. So having a sense that one's experience is not universal, and having a sense of great diversity of experiences of mental health, but also of gender and sexual diversities. Some examples from the yes, definite responses. Yes, I wouldn't have been able to validate myself without LGBTQIA communities speaking out online, nor would I have learned about sex ed in depth, learn to be open-minded and understand the spectrum of gender and sexuality. Yes, pretty much the only place I've met people with the same interests and values, supportiveness and community, when depressed. And I believe so. I use social media as an escape and as a way to connect with people who understand me, whilst the people I'm surrounded with in the real world are different and not understanding. As I said, escape comes up a lot, which also we need to remember that people are using places like Tumblr and a lot of online spaces for pleasure as well. So there's not just escape from your horrible parents, but to kind of, think about other things and learn other things even, but not in a super pedagogical sense. Okay, so what I did, I've gone the wrong way. So the 74%, the blue and the red, I looked at all of those responses. Interestingly, it's a close question, right? The people could have said yes or no. Most people didn't just say yes or no. Most people told us why, even though we didn't even ask. And I'm glad they did, because I've looked at those responses and I've sorted them for themes, and I've counted words, and these are references to these exact words or a version of these words. So the most popular word in describing why social media is beneficial is connection, followed by community, information and support, which is what the focus is usually on in the research, and then like-minded people and friendship. So I kind of like the way information and support is there in the middle. As I said, that tends to be our focus, but in a very individual way. But I would argue that those things are only provided on account of all the other things in that graph, through connection, community, like-minded people, and friendship. Another thing that I'm certainly really wary of talking about is social media as life-saving. I've never said it, I probably never will, but young people themselves, 5 young people in fact in that survey talked about social media as life-saving, particularly for themselves. So again, that's something I'm thinking about what to do with that. I think there's kind of a real danger in saying that, Tumblr is saving people's lives. But young people themselves saying that, I think we need to take that seriously and we need to, investigate that further. And last slide. Oh, all right. So in conclusion, I think we need better data on digital cultures of care. Hopefully by now that it's obvious why I'm talking about care, and why that might be a good framework for thinking about digital cultures of support and information and all the other stuff. I also think we need better data on sites, platforms, networks, and interactions that are most conducive to care. And again, this is a changing landscape. We know that Tumblr for 10 years or so has been that space for a lot of particularly trans and queer and non-binary young people. But that may be changing with the content regulation changes of last year. So we need to kind of keep an eye on that. There's whispers around that maybe Reddit is becoming that space. Maybe Twitter is a bit more that space than it used to be. But we need to think about what the spaces offer, the affordances of the platforms, and also how they're taken up, or how they might even be used in ways that weren't intended. We also need a less instrumental approach to social digital media. So we need to stop thinking about people as going to the internet or social media to find that thing that they need. And even some of the research on dating apps, I think there's a real problem there in the research. There's an assumption from the beginning that, okay, you're using Grindr, you're using Tinder, then you must want sex or a relationship. A lot of people are using it because they're bored. Like in that survey, our top response for a reason for using was boredom. So again, these are everyday media used, for multiple reasons. And if we're just asking people why, and not kind of thinking about how they might move around these spaces, we're going to have very limited data. So why digital cultures of care? Well, I think young people are not just seeking information and support, as I've mentioned many times, they're also caring for each other. And again, the research that asks them what they're doing, we don't ask people how they're caring for each other. We tend to assume they're in need of care and support, particularly because they're LGBT young people. So, they're vulnerable and whatever, and some of them are. But we kind of assume that they're looking for help. They're also providing a whole lot of help and support and care. And I think it's worth paying attention to that. And also how care is practiced beyond friendships and how it includes anonymous strangers, which I didn't end up talking in despite the title as much as I wanted to. But I think you can see through those data that a lot of people are engaging with strangers, people that are not their friends or in their friendship circle. And lastly, I think informal digital care can inform mental health policy and service provision for LGBTQ young people. Which again, we have all the evidence. We have over 10 years of reports saying that this is what's happening. I think we need to think about how that can inform policy. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Anyone like to open up the discussion?
I think you captured really well the kind of awkwardness that health promotion and other sort of health organizations have to try to capitalize on social media to, provide some of this information, because they often, set up a Facebook page or something like that, with the goal to share resources, missing the point that people go onto these spaces to use them and practice these spaces in very different ways, around networking, connecting. I don't want to go like some AIDS council page or whatever from my background. They go into this space that it's embedded in their everyday life. It's not.
Yes, absolutely. And there's some of the work around sexual health and health promotion, or sexual health promotion using social media that I've done. The literature on that, frustrates the hell out of me, because it's people saying we need to harness this thing where all the young people are. We need to, and they use words like harness, and I can't remember. I've written about it somewhere, but basically capitalizing on a space and seeing it as a venue. So it's kind of a clinic or a youth center. Oh no, it's Facebook. Okay, well, that's where young people go to hang out and do their stuff.
I think that's particularly the case because they used to say do health promotion outreach at say bars or sex or premise venues or something before the kind of social media age, and there's maybe an assumption that you can just kind of translate that a bit.
Yeah. And there's been, the settings-based approach. There's been some really nice critiques. Julika Loss was one of them, who actually looks at the settings-based approach and says, well, this is what that means. This is what social media is. Doesn't actually work. So can we stop talking about a settings-based approach or a novel setting as well? So translating exactly that into digital space.
I'll take the integrity of how I live my life, and just where I have brings difficulty when it's manifest, and just feel what works best. And I'll just feel, when I'm in for a desperado contact, and just because of situation where I live in it, just getting better, taking it easy with it, just how I sense myself, individuality.
Great, thank you.
The dynamic between care and intentional anonymity seems super fascinating. There's stuff around Tumblr. I just was wondering if you could speak to that a bit more. It seems it's like such an interesting platform where you have these meaningful friendships and relationships with people while anonymity is still maintained. Yeah, could you speak about the importance of care in that?
I think it shifts, and I think the interviews for Scrolling Non-Binaries that came out a little bit more than the surveys. But people did actually talk about making friends unintentionally through Tumblr. So you would be engaging with someone for a while, usually around fandom at first, and it's like, oh, you're trans, I'm trans, oh, and that kind of stuff was a really common. And again, this is going back to the people who aren't going online for support. So many of the interview participants who used Tumblr quite heavily said they went there for fandom, and they came away with all these queer friends and resources. But yeah, and people did talk about like making friends and moving to Twitter, or Facebook, or various other spaces where they do actually meet up, or they just need to have a platform with real names. But yeah, I'm still kind of thinking about the anonymity aspect as well. I think it's not, I don't know that it's always intentional. I think, do you want to say something?
I was just going to say, I'm doing some research around kind of people that have gone from Tumblr into Facebook groups.
Yep.
And a big thing that keeps coming up, and I'd love to hear about your opinion on it, is trust and the building up of the trust that happens within these anonymous communities, and then that gets translated, and then that's where names get brought into it, and then kind of the inter-communities and the interconnectedness that comes out from there.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear more about your research, and I think you probably have more on this than we do. But yeah, and on that note, I think because some people did talk about closed Facebook groups as being, as sometimes getting a bit toxic. Yeah. People talked about Tumblr as getting toxic, and in the paper, the International Journal of Communication paper that I mentioned that we had out this year, we have a section on that on Tumblr toxicity, which is kind of where people end up leaving Tumblr for that reason. And that seems to be something in common with those two.
Yeah, it's really intense. Most of the people that I interviewed think it was good, and then it's terrible, and then the group breaks down. And so I'm kind of doing, I don't know, aftermath kind of interviews about groups.
Okay, fascinating. I want to hear more about that. But yeah, there's definitely an intensity in those spaces, which often meant that one's participation was short-lived. And there was a really nice sense in that paper we talked about it as well, with people going, Tumblr's toxic, I hate it, I have to get out, my mental health's so much better now, but it was really, really important. Yeah. So it's horrible, but it's also amazing. And I think that is really important to think about and play with, and which we're still doing, I think. But did you know, I don't think I've properly answered that.
No, yeah, it's such an interesting space to think about all those things at the same time. It's such an opposite way of building up trust that you have in other contexts where you're being delivered care. That there's that kind of long-term building up through being anonymous or kind of partially obscure. You only have very limited bits of information about people. Rather than the opposite, which happens in health provision, for instance. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, how people are like you, but then you kind of only know that part of them and not a whole identity. Yeah, super fascinating.
And I think on that note too, I think it's also about the lexicon as well. It's obvious that someone's speaking from lived experience. It's obvious that someone's having similar experiences to you, going by what they say. If myself or someone who's never been on Tumblr jumped into that space and started to speak to that 15-year-old, you're going to be like, no, who are you? And so there won't even be, the trust will never get off the ground. Whereas if someone's kind of communicating and sounding very similar to you and being quite vulnerable in a way that you recognize, then I think that's part of the trust, I would say. I think someone.
Yeah, my question had to do, I asked the thing about the age because I have a teenage trans in my life that I absolutely love. But is that phase around 15? So I'm wondering also how different it is between how a 14, 15, 16-year-old engages with social media. Also being really different, even though they're young, but if you're 24, 25, 26,
yeah.
there can be a significant gap in the sense of just the difference, just anybody with any sort of experience, when you're 14, when you're 24,
yeah.
you're kind of different people. So I'm wondering if you were able to capture or have any sort of saying on this difference in terms of age from the very young to the older young adults.
Absolutely. It was younger people using Tumblr. And it was people, a lot of the people we spoke to had quit Tumblr, left Tumblr, and talked about it being 15, 16, 17. Like when they were 15, 16, 17, that was when it was really useful and really intense. That was kind of common. It wasn't across everyone. Some people stayed there, and some people talked about loving engaging with older generations. Like one interview participant told me that when Trump got in, Tumblr just went crazy. Everyone was very sad, and yeah, they were chatting to someone who was, I think, well, they assumed they were in their 50s, a 50-year-old gay guy, who talked about Stonewall and was saying, you know, this is just another thing, because look, we've had this and this and this, and they were really like enjoying that transaction as well. And so I think, and people I interviewed also said, well, you never know, like, you know, and people did have occasions where like I was chatting to someone, I thought we were kind of hitting it off, and then I found out they were 15. I was 17, and that was creepy. So there's yeah, it's blurry, but people tend to talk about it as their own experiences as being teens.
So I try not to read The Australian,
yeah, good.
particularly at the moment, it's just too distressing. But today I was in a coffee shop and it just happened to fall open. And the article was Hunt urged to probe transgender surge among girls. But it's all about, the argument is that social media is helping to explicitly instruct young people in learning how to become transgender, and a whole range of inquiries by apparently legitimate experts. I'm just really interested. This is directly connected to the research that you're doing. So would love to know how you're thinking about the framing of your research and including how you're kind of taking on board some of the changing context, which feels like it's changing relatively rapidly actually in the last few months. Around how you present your research, you know, how you might speak to it, that sort of thing in this context. Yeah,
that's a really excellent question, and to be honest, I haven't given it much thought because, like you, I don't read The Australian. I try to avoid reading about it as well. I kind of know what's going on, but absolutely, and I'm really hesitant. I think there's probably a tendency amongst researchers like myself and many in the room to kind of push back and go, no, I'm not saying that. Social media doesn't make people gay or trans or whatever, or use terms like heteronormative, but it kind of does. And I think I'm very interested in how participants in my research frame these sorts of things. And people do say Tumblr made me queer. They also probably more often say, you know, I figured out who I was. But there's also kind of, you know, there's a lot of jest around that too, like, you know, that social media makes you queer. So I kind of wouldn't say, no, that's not the case. But at the same time, I mean, I don't want to engage with that level of discussion. But I think it is a valid point because somewhere along the line I will have to. I don't know, and I'd love to hear from someone else in the room on this. Like, doing similar research, I know there's some of you here. Like, what would you respond to if people put that to you? Did you?
I'll be taking notes as
well. I guess it'd be interesting to know if these external sort of attacks get sort of discussed in these forums and what the reactions are, if there are sort of sort of try and protect their areas of care from that stuff, or if it's there's spaces where they connect to combat that stuff. I don't know, but it would be really interesting. I guess what you do about it.
Yeah, I guess the Australian we know aren't reading research from people like us. But yeah, there's a chance they might pick it up one day and go to town with it. And there are people here in Sydney, such as people I know at 2010 who have had their face and name splashed on the Daily Telegraph for being part of the safe schools, for all. So I think it is a risk that definitely I would like to think more about. Does anyone else?
Suggest that you shouldn't be leaving it so important, but just it's interesting timing as well as even picking specifically up on what's the role of social media and just the same.
Yeah. I think there's interesting correlations there too. Like the Australian is a troll, basically. So do we feed the trolls, or do we just kind of ignore it completely?
The Times also did a really similar article, like bring as well.
Okay.
It was really good.
Yeah.
About children being groomed online to be trans.
Okay. Yeah. And it's, I probably won't go into it much.
It's kind of similar to the suggestion that we had during the Facebook stuff that cultural Marxism that was leading into all the indoctrination of being queer, and to a certain extent it's kind of true. I mean, the left has been historically and in the academic institution, the humanities, social sciences has been a safe haven for queer studies and getting those big studies, feminism and all of those kinds of movements. So it's kind of not wrong, but it's obviously yeah.
Speaking of sort of trolls and trolling culture and toxic spaces, I was interested to hear you talk about, and this isn't part of your research, but to hear you talk about Reddit as a possible place people may migrate to. Tumblr. Where have you heard that? As a space that is kind of not considered safe in some cases, which a lot of people.
I can't actually remember.
Yeah.
I think from other researchers, other researchers of queer gender diverse young people. I think in that maybe there are certainly forums around queerness and trans forums and stuff, but I think are fairly well moderated. Yeah.
Yeah, Reddit's like very best in the way that it's community moderated a bit more so than Tumblr, where Tumblr you kind of curate and cultivate your own kind of thing, whereas Reddit, there's people who run certain forums and then they're completely top-down moderated. So there are some hellfire, like awful places within Reddit.
Yeah.
But I'd be interested to see, because it's a different uniformity in terms of the digital infrastructure, with what Reddit looks like compared to what Tumblr looks like, compared to what Facebook looks like.
Yep. Yep.
And the Reddit, the algorithm as well.
Oh, yeah.
Uploading and all this. How.
But like so many things are kind of like, that's like in your face uploading. But then like the same way that I guess the algorithms work with Tumblr and notes and the accumulation of notes, and also people appearing in your feed based on whether you follow them or not. In the same way that likes and like the way that the timeline on Facebook has changed to be like friends of friends and get closer at the top.
Yes.
Did people talk much about curating multiple Tumblrs in your data sets? Because I guess it has that affordance that people can kind of create different spaces, or if they found it toxic, they can delete their Tumblr and make a new one. And so when you're talking about like 16, 17-year-olds having a version, me and my friends, we sort of like ended up creating a second Tumblr at a certain age, and that was a much more refined curation.
Yeah, it did come up. Not hugely. And it was usually fandom stuff.
Yeah.
So my Sherlock Holmes fandom, that goes there.
Yeah.
My other stuff goes. It was kind of that segmentation.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. Didn't come up that much in the people I spoke. Yes.
I'm interested in this idea of we're not going into social media, we're in social media, but at the same time we are escaping and we are stuck. So
Yeah.
these kind of different spatial metaphors that are ongoing. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that, I did want to speak more about, actually, because it is, even though I am very much, there is no online, offline divide. The way young people obviously talk about it through many of those quotes, they are actually applying. I did this thing on Tumblr, for example, and going there to escape. So I think I think that might speak to, I don't know, I think there's just a history of how we spatialize the things we do. Whether they're, things we're doing with social media, or not. So I mean, do you have thoughts about this?
Really interesting. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Does anyone else? So I guess I'm still thinking about that. Like, I don't want to I kind of am speaking to the health professionals and promoters and researchers that I'm saying that, but I am also aware that young people are still applying that sort of spatial logic.
A bit of a hangover from going to chat rooms and sitting at your connected computer to the wall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I remember the early days going to the library and booking a 1-hour appointment. In that case, I was going on. But, right now I think I'm probably, in fact, I'm feeling vibration. As we all probably are.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us today.
Yes.
Excellent discussion.
Yes.